This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contrast. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. Your time is your greatest currency, make no mistake, and this fact of life does not go unnoticed by the creators on whom you spend your time. So thank you for spending your time listening and learning along with me on this podcast. On this members-only series, kicking off with this episode, we'll be looking at the 1070s through the lens of the Eastern Roman Empire. Constantinople found itself in yet another tumultuous 11th century decade. This decade would see 3 different emperors, the Seljuk Turks amassing vast swathes of land throughout Anatolia, a number of civil disruptions, a civil war or two, and near economic collapse. More than anything, though, the 1070s saw the rise of the next great Byzantine imperial dynasty, the House of Komnenos. This is Patreon episode 19, the first episode in our mini-series called The Book of Alexios, and it's entitled Prologue. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Manzikert, August 26, 1071. The bloodbath was horrific. The Byzantines were on the run, and the Turks were combing the dead for valuables. Soldiers from all across Europe and the Muslim world were represented on that battlefield. The Turks, originally from Central Asian steppes, were now pulling warriors from their own to Arabs from around the growing empire. Eastern Rome was largely a mercenary force, having very few who called themselves Romans. Franks and Normans from France, Anglo-Saxon defectors from a recently conquered England, Bulgars and Pechenegs from north of Greece and the northern shores of the Black Sea, Rus from way up north in the Riverlands, and of course, more Normans from Italy and Sicily. They all composed the Byzantine forces and the dead on that battlefield. Plenty of Turks lay dead and dying on the battlefield as well, but the numbers game was clearly won by Alp Arslan and his Seljuk warriors. In fact, the victory was so swift and complete that one entire contingent of support soldiers immediately left the battlefield and fled to Constantinople. They were led by Andronicus Ducas. Coincidence? With Constantine X's son, Michael Ducas, having missed his opportunity due to being so young, leaving the current emperor there on the battlefield might not have been a bad play on the throne. That current emperor, Romanus IV Diogenes, spent the afternoon fighting for his life, exceptionally, admirably, by all accounts, before ultimately suffering the perilous fate of a prisoner of war. On the battlefield, it must have been one of the worst feelings a warrior could feel. Romanus IV watched the rear guard under Andronicus leaving way out on the horizon, and when it dawned on him what was happening, he rallied everyone to push forward. The enemy was already fully engaged, and by no small number of sources and eyewitness accounts, there's pretty much universal consensus that Emperor Romanos IV was an incredible warrior, especially in that moment. His horse was cut down beneath him. He stood up and fought his way through dozens of attacking Turks until his sword-wielding hand was slashed and he couldn't grip the hilt any longer. He was immediately subdued and taken prisoner and had to endure watching his forces being slaughtered while he was dragged away helplessly. The emperor was quickly recognized and brought to Sultan Alp Arslan's presence, but here's where the sources diverge quite dramatically. The Arab sources swing way out in the direction of Alp Arslan being an absolute tyrant and bully, having the Byzantine emperor in front of him defeated, humiliated. He beat the emperor about the face and head until blood poured from Romanos's mouth, nose, and ears. At one point, Arslan ordered the shamed emperor to kiss the ground in front of the Sultan's feet, and when Romanos's lips touched the dirt, Arslan pressed his boot into the back of the emperor's neck and made some joke about his new imperial footstool, giving rise to the rumor that Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes of the Eastern Roman Empire was reduced by the Turkish Sultan to nothing better than a footstool. However, this doesn't jive with historical record, at least those written by Western sources. This story of Alp Arslan humiliating Romanos IV doesn't match up with those sources and what we know actually occurred in the months after Manzikert. I mean, it still doesn't turn out great for Romanos, but it still isn't as bad as the story we're given by many Arab sources. So let's start again, from the Western sources' perspectives. The emperor was quickly recognized and brought to Sultan Alp Arslan's presence. Broken and bloodied, defeated and humiliated, Romanos looked into the Sultan's eyes with hatred. Sure, there was some back and forth, one man rubbing in the victory, the other popping off at the mouth, but it was never violent like the Arab sources say it was. With what's about to happen, Romanos would never cooperate as well as he does if he were humiliated and beaten like the Arabs say he was. There was a moment when we're told that Alp Arslan asks Romanos IV what Romanos would do if the roles were reversed. If he had a defeated Seljuk Turk Sultan kneeling, broken and bloodied and humiliated in front of him. Well, without missing a beat, Romanos IV looked the Sultan in the eyes and said something like, well, that he wouldn't waste a breath and would just kill him. We're told Alp Arslan smiled and even laughed briefly. Addressing those in attendance, he said that Romanos IV was not to be harmed in any way, that the emperor had his personal promise of safety. Looking back at Romanos, Arslan told him that he knew he had honor because a dishonorable man would have lied to save his skin. What proceeded to happen just miles from the epic battlefield, the battlefield that would fundamentally change the course of world history, these two men would find common ground over the next week. In fact, Romanos would walk side by side with Alp Arslan, and a sort of friendship would develop between them. They spent hours together discussing each other's cultures, and an idea sprung from these conversations. If Alp Arslan could get Romanos IV back on the throne in Constantinople, then he could have leverage in negotiations with Eastern Rome in the future. Romanos would still be an independent leader, but Romanos was, again, an honorable man, and he would know deep down that he was forever indebted to the Seljuk Sultan. After being treated more or less as an honored guest, and not a footstool, again as the Arab sources say, it was only 8 days, and Romanos IV was given his men back, those who survived, that is, and the independence needed to get his Roman crown back. In addition, Romanos was forced to sign a treaty saying that regardless of what happened, the Seljuks would keep the territory they had already taken, which was a giant chunk of central and eastern Anatolia, as well as an annual payment of a rather large sum of money from Eastern Rome, indefinitely. But Romanos was single-mindedly after one thing: revenge. Oh yeah, his crown too, of course, there's that. But man, revenge against Andronicus Ducas would be just what he needed to regain some of his lost public honor. Romanos believed firmly, and he was probably exactly right too, that the hundreds of rearguard under Andronicus could have turned the tide in Manzikert. Romanos was convinced that the failure at Manzikert and his subsequent humiliation was squarely on Andronicus Ducas's shoulders. John Carr, in his book The Comnenid Dynasty, writes that the people of Constantinople, quote-unquote, received the news of Manzikert with profound shock. He references a contemporary chronicler named Ateliates, who said that the horrifying defeat at Manzikert changed everything. The chronicler's own words were, quote-unquote, the whole Roman state was overturned. The prevailing opinion was almost unanimous that Romanos was done. There was no coming back in the public eye from such a massive letdown to the already suffering empire. So what was next for the empire? The brother of the late Emperor Constantine X, Ducas, named John Ducas, dove into the political vacuum head first. Now, John Ducas was also the brother-in-law to Empress Eudokia, the lady who skipped over her own son, Michael, and married the handsome Romanos in the first place. Because, let's be honest, she wasn't quite ready to give up power yet. So if there was a way to get her, Eudokia, out of the way as soon as possible and reinstall another Ducas, remember, Romanos was a Diogenes, not a Ducas, then that's what he had to do. And things happened so quickly. It was almost as if the man had a hunch of what could happen when the emperor left for the east in the first place. Remember, it was this man's son, John Ducas's son, Andronicus, who left Romanos high and dry, way out there at Manzikert. Almost as if it were planned all along. Interesting. Now, there's no way of knowing for sure, but that's a pretty strong conspiracy theory, if you ask me. So it played out like this. Andronicus Ducas abandons the emperor at the battlefield of Manzikert. Within the week, he was marching back into Constantinople with the news of that defeat and the emperor's presumed death. This man we've been talking about, again, named John Ducas. Andronicus immediately visited his father, the man mentioned earlier, and the plan was set into motion. John Ducas still held great prominence within the political hierarchy, having retained his position as Caesar, which is just a step below the emperor and empress. John Ducas immediately usurps control over the Varangian Guard, which gives him the muscle behind his next steps. Empress Eudokia, again, former wife of Constantine X Ducas, mother of Michael Ducas, and current wife of the presumed dead Emperor Romanos IV, well, Eudokia was arrested by half of the Varangian Guard and quickly disposed of at a nunnery. The other half of John Ducas's Varangian Guard were sent directly to the palace to unplug Michael Ducas's Xbox and drag him, kicking and screaming, to the Hagia Sophia, where Michael was crowned the new emperor of all of Eastern Rome, and once again, a Ducas was on the throne. Michael Ducas became Emperor Michael VII, and it was as if the whole Eudokia Romanus debacle was behind the empire. The House of Ducas was at last again, after 3 years' hiatus, back on top of Byzantine politics. Now, the Ducai family and the Komneni family had a complicated relationship. It was a relationship formed in equal measure by competition and marriage. If you remember, both had been at or near the top of the political structure in Constantinople for at least a century, but they really pushed for prominence under the Emperor Isaac I Komnenos, just a couple decades earlier. Isaac, remember, was a Komneni, and he was the brother of John Komneni. Yes, 2 brothers of 2 emperors were named John Komneni and John Ducas. John Komneni was married to a lady named Anna Dalasini, and between them they had a handful of children, but their third born would emerge as one of the most pivotal emperors in all of Byzantine history. He's among those of all Roman emperors as well. Now, at this point, he was almost a man in his own right, maybe 16 years old, and already raised in the ways of diplomacy and warfare. Well, one of John Ducas's first moves was to throw Anna Dalasini, this young man's mother, mind you, into a nunnery. There must have been rumors that the Komneni would try to reclaim some of their recent glory. Otherwise, I can't see a rationale for this move. It certainly kept her sons, Manuel and Isaac and Alexios, in check for sure. Now, Manuel was old enough and respected enough militarily, by the way, to make a move should the support be shown to him. Alexios, as I said, was still a teen. Michael VII Dukas was crowned in November of 1071, despite the Komnenes lurking in the background. The year 1071 haunts Eastern Roman history, as we've seen. Between Manzikert and the loss of Bari back in Apulia to the dangerous Norman Duke Robert Guiscard, well, it was just an incredible low point for Constantinople. And this was the empire that young Michael VII inherited. There were still 9 more years left in the 1070s, by the way. It's just not a great way to kick it all off. As Michael VII took the throne, he realized that things around the empire were far worse than they seemed on the surface, and the surface wasn't looking great either. See, the Byzantine currency had already been slowly waning in its buying power for quite some time. But by Michael's time, each piece consisted of just over half of its original gold content. The rest were base metals and silver. In order to save the empire's purse, though, he needed as much gold to back it up as possible. But as bright as Michael was, much like his old man, Constantine X, he just wasn't a businessman. A chip off the old block, Michael excelled in philosophy and political theory and whatnot. Though immensely valuable in certain arenas in society, these were hardly bases of knowledge that held the keys to saving the floundering empire in any practical sense. Michael was forced to defer to his chief advisors, of which the chronicler and power broker, Michael Psellus, was the main one. In fact, it might very well be Michael Psellus's plan that Michael approved of next. The emperor enforced a policy that lowered the amount of gold per coin even further, and within the year, the entire breadth of the empire coupled Michael's name with some curse on their tongues. It was an unprecedented, purposeful devaluation of currency, what they called the Byzantine numismata. And things just went from worse to even worse. But we're not even sure if it was exactly Psellus's idea, though. There was another power broker much closer to the emperor than even the great chronicler was. Where Michael Psellus was Michael VII's original tutor as a child, he now had John Dukas, his own uncle, to contend with as well, the man who was responsible for putting Michael VII into the crown in the first place. But it was in the ensuing months after November of 1071 that these two trusted advisors to the emperor began seeing where their solutions to the empire's problems began to diverge. Diverge radically, actually. It soon became a power struggle between the two men behind the emperor's back. The whole time, Michael VII was beginning to develop a resentment, a deep, deep-seated resentment toward both of them. Keep that in mind. Now, as for the debasement of the currency, both men pushed for some immediate intervention, but regardless if it was Michael Psellus's or John Dukas's plan, what a shocking few great leaders in history, and even our present, fail to understand is that debasing currency is never the answer. Your lowly peasantry are the producers in society, and they are also the consumers. When you debase your currency, then you are not only cutting the money they earn, but you're also driving up the prices of the things they need to buy. Smaller paychecks equals higher prices at the checkout line. That is, when government begins tinkering around with the currency. Government intervention in the marketplace has rarely ever been a good thing. But that's what Michael VII chose to do, like our brilliant leaders today, and that's why Michael earned the nickname Parapanakes, which means minus a quarter in Greek. The moment the empire began feeling the price hike and the devaluation, Michael knew about it. Every report to come his way seemed to be laden with hateful rhetoric from the populace. However, Michael still had a purse that wasn't filling up as quickly as he'd hoped. So he raised taxes on top of all of that. The Balkans absolutely lost their crap. Michael VII was just 21 years old. And he was being manipulated by two men who hadn't the first idea how to accurately save the empire. When Michael VII took over in Constantinople, the Normans were pushing them out of Italy. forever, as history would have it. The Seljuks were pushing them out of Anatolia, forever, as history would have it. And the Balkans were boiling over with resentment, mistreatment, and more, yes, more, whispers of rebellion. Throw in rumors of Romanos IV still being alive and well under the protection of Alp Arslan, and now at the head of his own army of Byzantine POWs and Seljuk Turks, well, things weren't good. Now, there is an account of this time period left to us today. My Penguin Classics edition clocks it in at over 460 pages. And honestly, it's one of the best reads I think I've done in a very long time, to tell you the truth. It's hard to wrap my head around the fact that millennium-old writings can read damn near like a modern adventure or a thriller. And it stacks up against all the other Byzantine and Roman histories as well. To boot, it was written by a woman, which is a bit of a break from tradition. Her name was Anna Komnenos, and she absolutely adored her father. His name was Alexios Komnenos, and after his death she put onto parchment his story, which, after Manzikert, became intricately interwoven with and inseparable from the fate of Eastern Rome post-1071. She called her father's biography, this absolute brilliant epic, by the way, she called it the Alexiad, which directly connects her story of Alexios Komnenos to those of old. The Iliad, traditionally credited to the semi-mythical Homer, is an epic poem recounting the events of the Trojan War, focusing primarily on the wrath of the hero Achilles. The Aeneid, written by the Roman named Virgil, was an epic poem recounting the story of a survivor of that Trojan War named Aeneas, a Trojan, and his journey to Italy, thus establishing an origin story for Rome itself. The Thebaid, written by Statius, another Roman poet, was an epic poem of the history and legends around the famous city of Thebes. The Achillead was another Statius epic poem that attempted to establish Achilles' early life, but it was never finished. These are the towering works of Greek and Latin, of which the term Roman straddles both throughout the history of the Roman-Byzantine Empire. So you see the bold pronouncement that Anna Komnenos was making about her father's place in Roman history. This was hardly accidental, or just a clever play on titles. She was being very specific with this choice of title, and I truly think she believed her father deserved a place with the likes of Achilles, Odysseus, Paris, Hector, and Aeneas, among so many others. Ultimately, Anna was making it clear that this was one epic that should not be forgotten. And I gotta say, if all was true, I mean, of course she's writing with a considerable amount of bias. If all was true, this is an epic that should not be forgotten. So kicking off book 1 of the Alexiad, which actually consists of a whopping 15 books, Anna Komnenos writes, quote, "The Emperor Alexios, my father, even before he seized the throne, had been of great service to the Roman Empire. In fact, his military career began in the time of Romanus Diogenes. He already seemed remarkable among his contemporaries and exceptionally adventurous." End quote. She proceeds to introduce Alexios through an anecdote when he was just 14. Alexios' mother, again, Anna Delicini, denied his pleas to join the Roman forces heading east to solve this Turkish problem at the far edges of the empire. Alexios' older brother, Manuel, who was also already renowned throughout the empire, well, he had died recently. Now, I'd like to say that this death, as it's recorded, was one of heroism and all that, fighting the Turkish, heathen as they invaded Byzantine territory. No, although he was on campaign out in Anatolia and against the Turkish warriors, Manuel actually, he got an earache and he died of an infected ear. So nothing terribly heroic, but he did recently die in the wake of, or in the lead up to Manzikert. Alexios' mother, Anna, couldn't bear the thought of Alexios finding the same fate. Anna writes, Quote, "So he was left behind by his comrades against his will, but the future gradually opened up to him a fine opportunity for brave exploits." End quote.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
We now know the destiny of the Roman force heading east to solve the Turkish problem. We know what happened at Manzikert, and let's be honest, odds are that young Alexios Komnenos would most likely have suffered a terrible fate there, like so many of those men he saw marching out of Constantinople. But, as Anna Komnenos wrote, the future soon opened up for young Alexios in the wake of that disaster at Manzikert. She writes, quote, "In the reign of Michael Doukas, after the fall of the Emperor Diogenes, the Roussel episode proved how valiant he was." End quote. Now let's put a hold on that Roussel episode just for a bit here. Now, truthfully, I'm not sure Alexios was given an army at this moment. It would be really, really soon, but not quite yet. At the time, the Byzantine forces were split into two main armies. John Doukas, who had the title of Caesar, which is a position, again, directly beneath the emperor by this time in Roman history. Well, John was in charge of everything, but he was in direct control of one of those main armies. The other one was led by Andronicus Doukas, the same rearguard commander that left Emperor Romanus IV in the battlefield to defend for himself at Manzikert. Also, don't forget, Andronicus was the son of John Doukas. And it was these two armies that took to the field to confront that same Romanus, who was making his way across the 600 miles of highlands between Seljuk territory and Constantinople. Romanus, again, wanted his crown back. So unless he was made a commander of a small Balkan force, or was given a lower rank that she gussied up for the records, he couldn't have been a commander-in-chief in Anatolia, which is how I read Anna's words. So with that, as Roussel de Bayol, still in the service of Constantinople immediately after Manzikert, as he was just beginning to build his base of support way out east, there was this former emperor that needed to be dealt with. Romanus IV was the single greatest loose end that needed tied up before Michael VII could comfortably sit on the throne. I wish there was more information about it, but we do have the basics. John Doukas led the largest force toward the modern-day city of Tokat, called Dokai in 1072, and Romanus was, quote-unquote, stymied, says John Carr, and, quote, then roundly beaten by his ex-reserve commander Andronicus Doukas at Adana, end quote. It's worth noting that Andronicus Doukas agreed to terms of peace and promised Romanus would be unharmed with his protection, which is what prompted Romanus to surrender in the first place. Carr then goes on to quote Byzantine chronicler John Skylitzes, who explained that Romanus, now captured, was forced to ride a donkey for hundreds of miles northwest to the modern-day city of Kütahya. When they reached Kütahya on June 29th, 1072, against the terms that Andronicus had promised Romanus, John Doukas ordered the prisoner to have his eyes gouged out of their sockets. Even Michael VII had agreed to Romanus's peace terms, which included his submission to the cloth in a nearby monastery. I found the exact quotation from John Skylitzes' work, and I've expanded it from Carr's quotation. Now, I should preface that that John Skylitzes wasn't exactly spot on with all of his details. For instance, he confused Robert Guiscard taking Bari with his big brother Ironarm, William Ironarm, and instead of Michael VII, he says Michael V. Honest confusions, if you ask me, writing 1,000 years ago. He got the gist of it right, though, but I wanted to put that out there just for some intellectual honesty, if anything. Skylitzes writes, quote, "Harsh men took him and pitilessly, mercilessly put out his eyes, carried forth on a cheap beast of burden like a decaying corpse, his eyes gouged out and his face and head alive with worms. He lived a few days in pain with a foul stench all about him until he gave up the ghost." End quote. A rather ignominious end to a flawed but still somewhat respected man. Skylitzes added a detail which endears him more to modern sensibilities. For what it's worth, Skylitzes wrote, quote, "But in all his misfortunes he uttered no curse or blasphemy, continuing always to give thanks to God and bearing courageously whatever befell him." End quote. The chronicler Michael Ataliates wrote of the incident that Romanus was pleading with his captors to spare him. He would never rise up again, he pleaded. He would go away quietly, he pleaded. However, quote, "When he arose, his eyes were drenched with blood, a pathetic and pitiable sight that made everyone who saw it cry uncontrollably." End quote. Now, Carr adds something that I found to be a bit of medieval pettiness, unbecoming of a chronicler, more like what we're seeing by media pundits today toward either candidate or all candidates running for U.S. presidential office. Michael Sellis apparently wrote Romanus a letter while he was being paraded on the back of a donkey, humiliated and blinded. Sellis's letter said the following, quote, "The Almighty had found him worthy of a higher light," end quote, while straight up applauding what had occurred to Romanus. He said he should be grateful about his fate, writes Carr. Quote, "Such words could only be motivated by blind hatred, which shows the extent to which personal partisanship had poisoned the political atmosphere in Constantinople," says Carr. Now, sometimes people get caught up in their emotions and don't, put logic and reason and objective justice first and foremost. Luckily for the medieval mind, these were not held as cornerstones of society, even though there was still a strong sense of honor even among opponents. Case in point, the treatment of Romanus by Alp Arslan. Today, honor seems to be in many ways second to objective justice and logic. And yet here we are. As of this recording, it seems our modern world has gone a little medieval, forsaking our cornerstones. Just another connection to our ancestors, but I'd so much rather not have this one. Despite Sellis's venom, the former Empress Eudokia, Romanus' widow, and mother of current Emperor Michael VII, actually gave Romanus a grand funeral back in Constantinople. She was allowed, you could say, to leave the nunnery for this. And that was the last we will ever hear from Romanus IV Diogenes. And it was the summer of 1072. Now, Alexius Komnenos was not in the fields of Anatolia during this moment, but he will be soon. But everything occurring would directly impact this young man's future. Everything. Remember, there was a firm foundational relationship between the Komneni family and the Dukas family. But there was an often overlooked connection between Komneni family and the Diogenes family, the family of the slain and humiliated emperor, Romanus. See, Romanus IV's son, Constantine Diogenes, married Alexius Komnenos' sister, Theodora. When Romanus died in July of 1072, Alexius's mother, Anna Delicini, arranged this marriage to Theodora in the hopes of establishing more than one outlet with which to one day exploit. Even a shamed, blinded, and assassinated emperor could wield enormous weight in the future. The mere name was enough. So the Komneni family was intimately connected with the Dukas and the Diogenes families, So if you think about it, since the days of Isaac I Komnenos, Alexius's uncle, there have been one of these three families on the throne of Eastern Rome for what would be almost 3 decades by the time Michael VII is finished. This cannot be understated, these relationships that the Komneni family had with the power brokers in Constantinople. And by midsummer of 1072, Michael VII had no direct opponent to his reign. But he also had, as I mentioned before, completely devalued the empire's currency, which might be one of the worst things a leader can do, to be honest. At first, Michael VII wasn't about to take the fall, even though everyone knew he wasn't helping things. He did something that shocked most in Constantinople. Michael VII Ducas replaced his old tutor and current advisor, the chronicler Michael Psellus, the longtime power broker behind multiple emperors, and he replaced him with a eunuch named Nicephoritzes, showing us that, once again, eunuchs were still major players in the Byzantine court. Carr writes, quote, "The indefatigable Psellus's devious career had finally caught up with him," end quote. But why? Well, it was more than Michael VII not wanting to take the fall. If we dig deeper, we see that John Ducas, Uncle John Ducas, was also raising some powerful people in the background, high enough to have the emperor's ear. People like this very eunuch, Nicephoritzes, and another man, as Carr introduced him, quote, "a disputatious and superficial young firebrand named John Italos," end quote. In fact, John Italos was one of Psellus's students, and he and his teacher were accused of forsaking Christ for Plato on a number of occasions, which they had to fight, of course. Italos rose above it and became close to the Ducas family, thus exasperating any rift between Psellus and Italos himself. Michael Psellus, within a couple years of this move, humiliated and pushed aside into relative obscurity, would have his head tonsured and be shipped off to a monastery. It must have stung terribly, considering Michael Psellus had not only counseled young Michael VII after his father's death, and through the ordeal where his mother had pushed aside and married Romanos Diogenes, but Psellus was also a younger Michael's, again, personal teacher, and in the same vein that Aristotle was Alexander the Great's teacher as a boy. Psellus, without question, must have firmly believed his position was as solid as it could get, only to be undermined by his own student, John Italos, and the machinations of Uncle John Ducas. Now, Carr explained that the elevation of Nicephoritzes to replace Psellus was made crystal clear by what happened almost immediately afterward. Quote, "An ill-considered move by Nicephoritzes to centralize the grain trade as a state monopoly only raised the price of bread still further, dealing a serious economic blow to the main wheat growers in Asia Minor hinterlands. As inflation ate away at the people's purchasing power and morale, foes beyond the borders were making aggressive noises. The restive Bulgars had elected an aggressive new czar. Farther north, the Hungarians and Croats were turning against Eastern Rome, while in the east, a Norman adventurer named Roussel de Bayeul, a Roman army veteran, carved for himself a feudal statelet aiming to stem any Turkish advances in the region." End quote. Now, this is where we're going to call it for today. Things are just heating up in the Eastern Roman world, believe it or not. They're just heating up. You would think the culmination of the loose ends after Manzikert, the blinding and horrific death of a former emperor, the overhaul of imperial power structures, leaning now toward the Ducas family strongly, and the military finally getting a breather, might have served as an end to the tumultuous events recently. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. On the next Patreon members-only episode, we move on from this prequel, this prologue, to the rise of Alexius Komnenos, and we finally see the man in action. Once again, thank you for all your support, and I can't wait to tell you about the next chapter, Chapter 1, in the Alexius Komnenos story. Until next time.